Welcome to the Running Fundamentals course. This is a 10-part series. We're going to go over the basics you need to know to run. My name is Graham Tuttle. I'm the Barefoot sprinter, but I've been a lifelong runner. I've done track and cross country in high school and middle school. I've run through college, and I've been a coach that's helped people get back to running for years. So what we're going to focus on in this 10-part series is the basics you need to know to get started as a runner. There's an entire science behind the sport of running and maximizing your pace and your output. That's not something we're going to get into the weeds here, because I think running is a basic fundamental human expression. It's something that everyone has access to. So we're going to go over everything from how to pick the right shoes, how to deal with pains, how to start training for running, meaning what the right drills are, the basics behind the foundation of running, the principles of heating the body, everything from adding volume and then managing recovery to the competition mindset. So there's a lot we'll cover in this 10-part series, and we'll have one section for each of that. But we're going to start off with a pre-run checklist to see, are you even strong enough to run? So to break this down, I have a 3-question checklist that I think is going to cover the basics across the board of any running output. First, can you move your feet? While that might not seem directly related to running, it's important to remember that your feet are how you interface with the ground. They're what you use to run with. And if you also consider the fact that your feet and your hand have a similar anatomy, then you realize that if you couldn't move your hand, you would lose access to all the muscles of your forearm, and that means that your wrist, your hand, your elbow, and your shoulder would all be impaired. Same thing with the foot, the ankle, the knee, and the hip. If you can't move your feet, you will end up getting stiff and weak around the muscles of your foot, ankle, lower leg, and that's going to create the prerequisite or the first starting conditions for long-term pain. The itises, so to speak, tendinitis, patellar tendinitis, Achilles tendinitis. If you want access to that, to be able to have healthy tissue, you need to be able to move your feet. Basically, you can run without moving your feet, but you will get injured at some point. And so if you want to run long-term and not get injured, you need to have access to your feet. Second, can you jump rope without pain? Now, ideally, you're doing this barefoot or in a minimalist shoe, but your body is essentially a muscle and bone and organ that's wrapped in this fascial suit. We'll come back to fascia in the Ply Metrics portion of this series, but what you want to know is that fascia is the thing that provides the elastic strength and support for your entire system. When you hit the ground and bounce off, that's partly your fascia, also your tendons, which is part of your connective tissue. But if you don't have access to healthy tissue and elastic tissue, you will end up absorbing all of the force of impact for every single step with passive tissue, which is going to be your bones, your joints, and that is not going to be healthy long term. So if you can't jump and be light and bouncy, you're going to end up in issues quickly because your joints won't be able to handle the impact of 10,000, 20,000, 100,000 steps, and that is a recipe for disaster. Third is, can you sprint? And ideally, can you sprint barefoot? Sprinting is the expression of optimal running form because everything has to be able to come together, and it means you're strong enough and you have the optimal movement capacity. You'll notice that running form doesn't change as the intensity scales. So if you want to run slow or run fast, it's the same form. You're still landing in the same portion of your foot, it's still moving the same way. What changes is the variables that scale up. How aggressively you're picking your knee up, how short your ground contact time is, how aggressively you're swinging the arms, how much spinal coiling you have. Those things are the variables that scale up to allow you greater force production. But past that, running form is conserved across different surfaces and different speeds, different outputs. So the question is, do you have the ability to produce force at the highest output of running, which is sprinting? If you don't, you're going to run into issues somewhere down the line. So if you can sprint, you can do it all. It's essentially like saying, if you have a spare tire on your car, you're only able to go so fast. And that's what most people get used to running with, is they kind of get used to running as though they're using a spare tire. And they're like, well, I don't want to go too fast. The problem is you avoiding that thing is going to bring that ceiling lower and lower and lower until eventually you have issues running at a slow pace or walking. And that means you're not going to be able to run well. So if you can sprint, and if you can sprint barefoot, it means you have the strength and the ability, the form, to be able to manage the highest output and your system is working effectively. So if you can do those three, move your feet, you can jump, and you can sprint, you have access to run at any pace and any output, and everything else is just building up the specific tissue quality to be able to manage whatever the demands of your specific run are. But remember, running is a basic human capacity. You have access to it. If you have an able body, you can run. If you're in pain, something's wrong. So before you continue to add on more miles and more density, fix that and then build up from there. Now, if you're listening to this and realize that one or all three of those is missing, you don't start with the sprinting. You start by getting movement and access back in your body. That's what the Athletic Foundations program is for. I've been exactly where you are, and I know how to go from being in pain and stiff and broken to being mobile and active and athletic. So that's the process. You start at the beginning, your foundation. And once you have your foundation underneath you, then you can move on to the fun stuff, which is exploring the world through running. And that's what we'll cover in part 2, which is what technology you need to run well. We'll talk all about shoes. Welcome to Running Fundamentals Part 2. This is Graham Tuttle, the Barefoot Sprinter. We're going to talk about shoes, specifically how to pick the right shoes. But before we get into the aspects of a good shoe and recommendations, it's important to remember that shoes are technology. And before we had the modern running shoe in about 1970 with foam and nice comfortable soles, we had nothing. That means we were barefoot for hundreds of thousands of years. Yes, humans have been using shoes and technology with plant or leather or metal, but before we had plastic and foam, we had to make do with what was available, and that wasn't very comfortable. So shoes were used as a status symbol, or they're used as technology, but they weren't the ubiquitous thing that we see now, meaning that every single person is always wearing the shoe. So what I want you to remember is that you have to think of the foot as distinct from the shoe. The problem is that if you believe and get sucked into the marketing of mainstream shoe companies, you might forget that. And you might think that all you need to run is the right shoe. And yes, some shoes are better than others, and some shoes have more specific use cases for running than others. But ultimately, you can do everything you need to do barefoot. And so with that, then you could say, you can build from the foundation that my feet are the most important part, and if I start from a strong, healthy, capable foot, the shoe adds to that. So, not all shoes are created equally. There are four aspects of a good shoe. It's flat, it's flexible, it's wide, and it's thin. It's flat, meaning the heel and toe are on the same level. Your foot is on the same level. It's zero drop, meaning your heel and toe are flat when you're barefoot. A shoe should mimic that. There is no reason other than aesthetic, you're looking taller, to have a raised heel. It's flexible, meaning the midsole is flexible and can bend. That's important because every single step you take is going to shape and remodel the bottom of your foot. If you don't have access to a shoe that's flexible, you will get stiff. And it may be 1 or 2 degrees you lose of flexion every single step, but after 10,000, 100,000, a million steps, that adds up. You want a shoe that's flexible. You want wide, or specifically foot-shaped. You want enough space for your foot to be able to wiggle, your toes to be able to wiggle. Again, we talked about this in part 1, but if you don't have access to moving your toes, you lose access to all the muscles of your foot, ankle, and lower leg, and that creates stiffness in the system, and that creates the higher likelihood of getting the tendinitis irritations that end up ruining most running careers. And fourth, and least important, is you want it to be thinner. Now, by thinner, I mean that the padding is a negotiation between your environment and your preference for how much discomfort you want to go through. So if you wear a super minimalist shoe where you can feel everything, it's going to be uncomfortable. Yes, when you walk on gravel, it does not feel good. You get a little bit more of a grounded centeredness on the ground. You can feel the terrain, but the amount of padding you have is up to you. That being said, the higher you go, the higher your likelihood of an ankle sprain is. So I like to keep it under 24 millimeters, which is about 1 inch or less. So 22 to 24 millimeters of stack height is the max I'd ever recommend, even for longer distances. Now, if you're looking at ultra marathons and things like above 40, 50, 100 miles, essentially that becomes glorified walking. And so that's a different conversation where you look at the Supermax shoe, but that's a sport in and of itself. Those types of sport-specific footwear make sense in that environment. But for every other part of regular running, a 22 or 24 millimeter stack height is the max you need. Now, the reality is if you go too low, you're going to end up putting a lot more load on your foot and more likelihood of stepping on rocks and getting aromas. I've had issues like that in the past. And that's fine. I mean, people run barefoot, so it really is a tolerance issue. But you got to realize that at some point, you can't let perfect be the enemy of good. If you want to wear 5 fingers or minimal sandals or run barefoot, that's absolutely fine. It's phenomenal. And it really helps you feel the ground, and it gives you the most connected sense of running. But if you want some padding underneath, that's fine. Because ultimately, the padding, if it's even and flexible and flat, you're not going to interrupt the running form. You can run correctly in any shoe. Some shoes just make it harder to do. Building off of that, it's important to know the difference between a training shoe and a competition shoe. There's a lot of super shoes that have a carbon fiber plate. If you're training for the max speed you can run in a 5K, a half marathon, or marathon, that's a sport. That's a decision you make to go and pursue a specific output. That's not to be confused with health. If you're trying to run and learn the art of running, you want something that gives you the most feedback possible. The reality is that most people skip the foundation, their feet aren't strong enough, they jump into running and they get trapped in the cult of more, and they think, I started with a 5K, I'm gonna do a 10K, do a half marathon, they go more and more and more, but they never do the strength training, they don't work on the form, and they can't move their feet, so they don't have a foundation, and then they end up getting hurt. And so they think, well, I can run in this shoe for 3 miles, but every time I go to 5 or 6 miles, my feet start to hurt. Maybe I need a different shoe. And they think that the more padding is gonna help them. But that's part of the marketing of the shoe companies, which says, buy the right shoe, buy the right product, and replace it every few months. It's kind of like a drug dealer. They need to get you hooked, they need to get you coming back to the same thing over and over again. And I'm not saying that there isn't value in replacing your shoes and all that stuff, and value in having, fancy new foam because it does break down, whatever. There's value in some truth in it all. but it's a distraction from the fact that if you skip the foundation of having strong feet, you will end up in a spot where you're continually chasing the next bigger shoe, and eventually you're going to end up in Hokas and having multiple inches of padding, and it's never going to get better. So if you skip that and you wear a competition shoe and think that's going to solve for your lack of foundation, you will end up prolonging to bigger injuries and ultimately lose your ability to run in the long term. The next question is how to transition from a conventional shoe to a more minimalist or foot-friendly shoe. Now I'll break this up into 4 different categories. First, you have your conventional shoes. That's going to be your Asics, your Brooks, your Saucony, whatever it is. The typical shoe that has a raised heel, a lot of padding underneath, it's a stiffer midsole, got some type of pronation support, and it's going to have a tapered toe box. Horrible for you. And just because everybody wears them doesn't mean that they're any better. You gotta realize that most of these top runners are paid or sponsored by these shoe companies who are then going to wear the shoes. That doesn't necessarily mean it's ideal for them. But remember, the conventional shoe is not your friend when it comes to having a healthy, strong foot. After that, you don't have to go to a minimalist shoe, which just has no padding underneath. You can do what's a foot-friendly conventional shoe. I look at something like an Ultra Escalante Racer, which is going to have a wide toe box, it's flexible, it's flat, but it has enough padding, about a 22 to 24 millimeter stack height. That's going to give you enough space for your foot to be friendly, and I think that's a great option for road running, hard surfaces, or mid to long distance running. Even up to a marathon, I think that's more than fine. And you can start to work down to something like a minimalist shoe. Now, the thing to remember about minimalist shoes is that once you have any amount of separation from the ground to your foot, you are no longer getting the grounding earthing effect, meaning you're not getting the exchange of electrons. So even though it's flat, flexible, and wide, the thinness is just a comfort level. If you really like running in something like a Vivo or a Zero or a Field Grounds where you are basically 2 to 5 millimeters off the ground, that's absolutely fine. I don't think there's a benefit of doing that over a 12 to 20 millimeter stack height shoe when it comes to running well, because ultimately the flat, the flexible, and the wide are what make the difference. But if you enjoy the minimalist feel, then absolutely go for that. But then you can move to what I like. So if I'm going to be in a minimalist shoe which is very thin, I like to be able to feel the ground but maximize my foot capacity. That's where I will wear a Vibram 5-finger or a Shama sandal, a Huarache style sandal, because it lets my foot maximally move, it separates the toes, and it engages the most natural feel of my foot while also being thin, but I'm not having the same. You have to realize that the conventional shoe shape that ties your feet together in one little lump and the socks that wrap around that, it's not really training your foot to be different. I think it's really important if you want to maximize your foot that you have differentiated toes. Now there's 2 parts of that. One is a shoe that has a separated toes, and 2 is a sock that has separated toes. Even if you're wearing no different shoes, you're just wearing the conventional shoes or super shoes, wearing toe socks is a huge game changer all the time. I'm a big fan of toe socks. But if you can wear toe socks inside of a toe separated shoe, that's even better. One shoe I'll add in here that's a new option is called the Peluva, P-E-L-U-V-A. It's a toe separated shoe with a little bit of padding. I'm a huge fan of my Vibram 5-fingers, but Peluva's taken that and added a little bit of padding underneath, which makes it much more accessible for most people. I think that's a fantastic option. So in general, I wear my Escalante Racers or my Peluva, which is a padded shoe with the 12 to 20 millimeter stack height for almost all road, mid, or long distance running. And if it's sprinting or short distance running, I'm either in sandals, 5-fingers, or barefoot. But you think about the transition in that realm, because every transition you go from a conventional shoe down to the maximalist shoe, A is a preference, but B works along one of the 4 matrices. If you go from raised heel to flat, that's a win. From narrow toe box to wide toe box, that's a win. From stiff midsole to flexible midsole, that's a win. And then eventually from super maxed cushion to thinner cushion, that's a win. And that transition gives you a steady on-ramp to a healthier shoe, and eventually that also supports your foot getting stronger within the shoe. So in summary, remember, there's a difference between competition and training shoes. When it comes to competition, you're training for output and force, that's a different decision. When it comes to a healthy shoe, it's flat, wide, flexible, and thin-ish. And there's always a benefit of having toe separated shoes, especially wearing toe socks. There's a bunch of different shoes you can get out there, so I'm not going to list specific brands because those are changed and I don't want to be liable to specific companies in the future and they're always shifting. But I will say, if you find a pair of shoes you love, buy a bunch of pairs because companies are always shifting and they always have this designed obsolescence. And that means that the shoe you love this year might be gone or outdated or changed next year. And if you remember from part 1, we have our 3-part checklist of running. Can you move your feet? Can you jump? And can you sprint? And now we've covered the logistics of shoes in part 2. We're ready to go to part 3, which is how to deal with the pain and discomfort of running and how to deal with those little aches that pop up along the way. We'll see you there. Welcome to Running Fundamentals Part 3. I'm Graham Tuttle, the Barefoot Sprinter. Today we're going to talk about pain. Now, sometimes when things hurt, you might find yourself on the bleachers. But to keep yourself off the bleachers for too long, it's important to know the difference between the little irritations and the big problems. But just like any issue with running, if you don't pay attention to it when it's a small blister, it turns into a big issue over time. So most issues happen in running because it's the same thing over and over and over again. Unlike other sports where you can kind of work around it, if something happens that causes pain from running, that will continue to get exacerbated every single step for tens or hundreds of thousands of steps. So it's really important to build a foundation so you can preempt a lot of the issues on the front end, but also know what's happening and know how to address the small stuff when it first pops up. Because if you don't nip it in the bud, it will become a long-term issue. And that's the difference between having something that's just a short-term inconvenience versus something that wrecks your running career long-term. No one ever starts off thinking that that little bit of plantar fasciitis is going to ultimately keep them from running again, or the Achilles tendonitis, or the shin splints, or the patellar tendonitis, or the turf toe, or the big toe arthritis. Those things start off small, but they add up to big things over time. The most important thing to understand is that if you're in pain, it's almost a guarantee that you're not strong enough. When we don't have the strength to support our running form over the distance or the pace, we end up compensating. That means we end up heel striking, we end up overstriding, or we end up collapsing in either at the ankle or the knee or the hip. And that causes impingement and that causes irritation at the joint. So the way you fix that is by prioritizing your form by working on speed work, prioritizing your strength by working on your weightlifting and your overall mobility, and then prioritizing the rest and recovery, meaning we have to build up and adapt to the tissue demand of a volume or an intensity over time. After strength, the most likely indicator of injury is you don't have enough mobility, meaning you don't have enough requisite range of motion in your tissue. So what you have to understand is that running in a sedentary, stiff range of motion is kind of like being stuck on a couch. You might be moving some part of your body, but you're in the same position. You're making the same movements over and over and over again. A lot of people go into running because it's something that's accessible for them. They have shoes, they can get outside the running pants, and then they go and run. But they don't think about switching that up, and they lose the requisite mobility. They can't sit on the ground, they can't get off the ground, they can't touch their toes, they can't move their feet, they can't flex their knees or the hips fully, they lose rotation of the hips, and these things create stiffness in the tissue. You have to think of your body like a sponge. If you don't have access to move all the tissue and to squeeze the water out, the sponge gets stale. And you end up in a situation where instead of being able to have a pliable, healthy, vibrant fascial suit, you end up getting stuck and stiff. You can imagine wearing a full suit that gets stiff in one area. If I took a big handful of cloth, it would prevent the overall suit from moving correctly. And so your body responds to motion and movement. And if I'm not pushing and pulling the tissue and creating this traction and pulling stimulus on your tissue, I'm not hydrating it. And then it gets dehydrated and it gets stuck. And that creates long-term deficits in your ability to keep healthy tissue. That irritated, dried out, dehydrated tissue ends up creating the joints that no longer move. That creates the itises of the tendonitis where the connective tissue, the tendons, the ligaments that surround the wrap a joint are no longer stretchy. And then it starts to creak and then your body feels stuck. So if you're not mobile enough, you end up losing the hydration for your entire fascial suit. The biggest likelihood is if you're running a lot, you're not diverse enough in your movement, meaning you need to think of running as one part of the overall movement recipe. There's a context of running, which is typically you'd be running and changing direction, changing elevation, stepping left and right, stepping over objects, or slowing down and moving in different directions. That's the diversity of movement. If you lack the diversity of movement because you're just running on the same two-dimensional, pristine, flat surface and just going in one direction, or you're stuck on a treadmill, you end up in this place where your brain and your body stops getting the movement stimulus it needs to stay healthy, which is why it's so important to think about multi-directional movement, playing sports, jumping, changing directions, running at different paces, doing hill sprints, going down hills, jumping over things in a like a track or an agility-like manner. There's so much variety to stuff. So as part of the running warm-up, if you can add in things like A-skips, lateral skips, movements in different directions, it's important to keep your body and your brain smart. Because if you only do one thing over and over and over again, you lose the diversity that keeps you young, playful, and healthy. And before we move on, it's important to touch on all the common symptom treatments that people go to, specifically orthotics. Most people at the first line of discomfort, they go straight to a podiatrist or a doctor and ask, hey, my foot hurts, my ankle hurts, what should I do? And you go to a podiatrist, their first line of defense is to put you in an orthotic. Now, that does not mean that there's not value in orthotics or that there isn't a use case for them, but you have to realize that these are not long-term supports. These are not long-term problem solutions. They're just symptom treatments. Essentially, what an orthotic does is it stabilizes your foot. It keeps it from moving. If you stabilize your foot, you might shut off the pain symptom because you're not irritating the same tissue, but you will ultimately make that worse because you are decreasing the strength of the foot and decreasing the hydration of the tissue at the foot, and you're increasing the leverage of the amount of force that you have to put at the ankle or the knee or the end of the foot, because the foot is no longer bending as a unit. So remember, if you go to an orthotic, if you go to a doctor and they put you in an orthotic as the first line of defense, it is not a good solution because you have to have an egress method to get out of it. You need to have a plan. An orthotic can be part of a plan. It can be a time where if you have a very severe, painful stimulus and you need to stabilize your foot, or let's say you've broken some part of your foot, you can use an orthotic in a very short-term stint to be able to build off of that. But if you don't have a plan to get movement back and strength to your feet, you will ultimately end up worse off. For people that go in, and I see it all the time, a 60, 70-year-old podiatrist will put an 8-year-old kid in an orthotic without any plan to get out of it, and then that ends up in a lifelong death sentence for the foot. If you put in an orthotic, it is a straight line from that to knee injuries, to continued knee pain, and to prolonged and more severe foot injuries. So remember, braces, support shoes, orthotics, those all treat symptoms. Anything that takes away the mobility of your foot ultimately weakens your system. Your foot doesn't need the support, it is the support. And if you forget that, you end up using extraneous methods to try and create that. Pain is a signal that something is not right. You're either not strong enough, you're not mobile enough, you're not moving diversely enough. And if you ignore that and just use symptom treatment and pain pills and ice and inflammatories and orthotics and braces, you will end up making that worse, and that will wreck your running career. But if you start and pay attention to the small pains as soon as they pop up, and you build off the foundation, and remember the first checklist, first, be able to move your feet, second, be able to jump, third, have the strength to be able to maintain the appropriate running form. Then you work on shoes that continue to let your feet be feet, none of this pronation control support, none of the stiffness stuff, none of the anti-roll bar, and that allows your feet to build a strong foundation. And that is the ultimate solution to get out of pain. You might have to step back, you might have to scratch a different itch, but that's why it's valuable to have cycling or swimming or some type of paddling, something that's going to scratch the itch for you outside of running. But if you don't have enough diversity in your life and you only have running to scratch the itch, you'll continue to exacerbate the pain. Remember, there's a context to this. You will get through the pain, you'll move past it. But if you don't nip this in the bud right off the bat, it will get worse, it will snowball, and you will end up in a much worse situation. Which ultimately brings us to part 4 of our series, talking about strength training for running. And we're going to cover that next. But remember, if you're in pain right now and you don't have guidance on where to go, I have support for you. I've been there. I've had so many foot issues and I've helped so many people get out of it. It's an athletic foundation program will get you a fresh start and get your feet healthy so you can build off that for any type of running you want. That is in the links below or somewhere associated with this video. Get on that, start for free, you can make a huge difference. And once you start to get that foundation of pain-free movement underneath you, then we can go to part 4 and start talking about strength training. That's next. Welcome to Running Fundamentals Part 4. I'm Graham Tuttle, the Barefoot Sprinter, and today, in this session, we're talking about strength training. And the bottom line is, you need to do it. But strength training doesn't necessarily just mean lifting weights. However, that's a big part of it. The first thing to understand is that running is a form of strength training. So that means that by running, you are getting stronger. The problem is that all strength training needs to have some form of progressive overload, meaning you have to continue to make it harder, because if you don't make it harder, your body adapts to what you're doing. So if all you do is steady state running at a low intensity and continue to do that, or walk, you're going to make that your ceiling. So you have to do things like sprinting and speed work and hill sprints to be able to maintain a higher ceiling so that everything else is sub-threshold. Having some form of speed and strength work as part of running is a sport-specific way to develop your capacity. In fact, the ancient Romans and Greeks used to use jumping and running as part of their strength training. So if you go out and you do short 100-meter, 200-meter sprints, or you're working on even shorter distance stuff or multi-directional stuff, that's an incredible way to develop your strength. Same thing with hill sprints. All these things work to get you stronger. That's going to improve your neural output, your skill, and your tissue tolerance. But that doesn't mean you get to skip the gym. And by gym, I mean some form of meaningful strength training with load. And the reason you have to have load is because load puts consequence on movement. By that, I mean that you have to learn to organize your body under a certain set of gravitational principles. If I just raise my arm out to the side with no consequence, this is great. But because I don't have to use any type of meaningful tissue organization, I don't actually have to learn the pattern of what I'm trying to do. There are certain muscles that pull on bones within fascial networks that create the movement patterns that we live through. When it comes to running, we cannot skip the part of having to organize that. Picking things up and setting them down, or throwing them, or rotating, or learning to lunge or squat, those are all movements. And those all combine to getting our joints strong and our muscles functional and our fascial lines conditioned appropriately. Strength training is what conditions your body to understand how to organize underneath load. But what should that strength training look like? Well, there's a lot of options for strength training, and if you're doing anything, it's going to be better than nothing. But it is important to make sure that you're not falling into another sport. Olympic lifting is a sport, crossfitting is a sport, Powerlifting is a sport. Bodybuilding is a sport. Strongman is a sport. These are all sports, and you're going to have sport-specific movements. If you're going to bench press or snatch, those are sport-specific movements. And by that, I mean that you are learning to go to a certain depth and a certain range of motion that's required for competition. That does not necessarily mean that's the most functional for your body or the most healthful for your joints. So there are options. For example, instead of benching with a straight bar, you can bench with a multi-grip bar. It's an option because you're not training to be a powerlifter. You have options. So when you go look at training, remember, the world is your oyster. You can use a bunch of different implements and a bunch of different ranges of motion to get creative with it. That being said, these sports are generally organized around specific movements that are pretty global. So doing things like a squat, a bench, a deadlift, some form of a clean or hip extension, some form of a sandbag carry or a sandbag clean, or even just bodybuilding stuff with chest flies and bench presses and lunges. Those are all fantastic options to organize your body. So if you're doing anything, it means you're training your body to organize under load, and that generally, if you are continuing to pair that with running, will create a stronger, more resilient frame for running. That being said, there's a handful of principles I think that are really valuable that are going to help improve your overall training outcome. First is training unilaterally, which means we're using one side at a time. That could be a single arm bench press, a lunge, a split stance RDL, a split squat. Those all work one side at a time to help eliminate asymmetries, and they work on your coordination from one side to the other, and they work your core intentionally to stabilize. Second, work with your body in terms of functional patterns. So you want to think about stuff like sandbags or things that you hold internally to create torque within you. Those create this internal rotation, external rotation patterns that are so valuable for running. I'm a huge fan of sandbags. That's something I've really picked up and used for the last half a year at this point, and it's made a tremendous difference for my running and overall movement because it is intuitive, it's easy to learn, and it's very hard to mess up and very hard to get hurt with because you can pick up and your body is organizing in the way that it's designed to. So working functionally, but that also means just using your body in the pattern of having to stabilize and lift things, which essentially boils down to not using machines. I'm not saying machines are not pointed. We'll come back to the next part. But it is important to think about the fact that functional training uses your body as the structure and you work around you use that to negotiate with the environment. Thinking functional, sandbags are fantastic. Kettlebells are another option. Maces, clubs, those all get you rotating and coiling. They're a fantastic way to unlock and open up your body. Third, think about muscle range of motion for what you can engage. This is where machines can be really valuable. Doing something like a leg extension or a pec fly may not seem specifically functionally related to running, but it is incredibly important to connect with the muscle. And just because your muscle can anatomically move through a full range of motion doesn't mean you have that contraction and that ability when you're conscious and you're trying to use that under load. So by using machines, whether it's a cable fly, whether it's a hamstring curl machine, those things can teach you to engage with your muscles. This is the value of bodybuilding because it trains you to feel your muscles engage and it helps you find tension through a full range of motion. But you have to pair that with understanding that the tissue needs to go through a full range of motion. So there are muscles that work at joints, and then there's tissue, fascial lines that work across joints. This is the part of the mobility aspect where you have to think about stretching and opening up across long ranges of motion. This is value of something like yoga, or let's say even the fascial maneuvers, like a human garage approach, where you're thinking about your body starting to open up in long stretched out positions. This is what keeps your tissue hydrated and healthy because you're pushing and pulling and remodeling that tissue along a full range of motion. So the muscles contract to create tension, and the long stretched out maneuvers keep the tissue healthy. And this is also important because this is your mobility training. One of the things that people misunderstand is they think of mobility training as a separate part from strength training. But all mobility training is essentially strength training at a lighter load under a longer range of motion. So effective stretching is essentially stretching or under load to a full range of motion. So when you think about training both the muscle in a short range of motion and contracting and getting better engagement and working on this fascial tissue, this connective tissue that stretches and pulls your entire body, that is the quintessential strength and mobility spectrum. You have to work on both sides because if you just do your muscle and you don't work on your connective tissue, you'll get stiff and stuck. But if you just do your connective tissue and open up long, you'll be lax and you won't have any ability to create strength in these motions. We want mobility, which is a crossover of strength and range of motion. We don't want laxity, we don't want stiffness. We want strength and we want intentional stiffness in these positions. That's mobility. So if you do it all together, you'll have a healthy system that's strong, that's mobile, that's elastic and resilient, that then can go and be durable in any setting. And that's the most important part, is you have to remember that running is a contextual piece. It is one part of the equation. You can't just go and run and scratch that itch and then not do the other parts to take it seriously. If you want to be a runner and if you want to take it seriously, you have to support that entire endeavor. Running is one piece. A lot of people get started because it's fun and it's accessible and they just want to do that. They want to keep doing that, and they don't develop other tools. Lifting weights, being able to do sprints, being able to play sports, swim, throw, calisthenics, all these other pieces, those are important parts of the puzzle. And just like any good balanced breakfast, there's a bunch of things to go into it. Running is just one part. And if you become a running junkie and you only do that running itch, you'll lose your range of motion, you'll get stiff, you'll get injured, and you'll lose your fun personality because no one likes to be around someone who can only run and not do anything else. So don't be a junkie, be well-rounded, make sure you take your strength training, because that will focus on using your body as a resilient unit. And that leads into the next part, which is a spinal engine theory. And that's what we'll talk about in part 5, which is understanding your body as a fluid unit that is a system that works together for a goal. And remember, if you need help getting your body moving and understanding where to start with strength training, what that looks like, I have resources for you, specifically my Athletic Foundation program. It'll teach you how to connect your body, get you moving, get you out of pain, and get you the basic foundation for what strength training could look like, and you can build off from that. Once you start to get those things down, then we can start thinking about your body as a bigger unit. And I'll see you in the next part with spinal engine theory. Thanks for watching. Welcome to Running Fundamentals Part 5. I'm Graham Tuttle, the Barefoot Sprinter, and today we're going to talk about spinal engine theory. Now, this is going to be a little bit of a side detour, but it's really important to understand the philosophy behind running. Because if you just think about running as a very sedentary, stationary, one-dimensional thing, you miss the fact that it's this entire integrated system of motion. So, the different philosophies behind how the body moves, but ultimately it comes down to everything happens from the spine. Like if you hurt your back, what are you going to do? Everything has to get stiff. And what you notice is that people that have stiffness in the spine, they have to swing their arms and legs more widely to be able to make up for the fact that their spine can't move. If you want a fun little people watching thing, pay attention to people as they walk. People that have this natural saunter and this natural gait, they have a rotation as their spine coils and their hips and their shoulders start to just move in this oscillating pattern. Kind of like a snake or a lizard or any type of a leopard that walks. There's this natural suppleness. But people who've gotten stiff and their back no longer moves, have had a surgery or a disc issue, they start to walk and their spine doesn't move, but they swing the arm and legs much further. But that just goes to show that everything happens around the spine. What you notice is that a lot of people will teach in this very one-dimensional motion where they think I have to do A skips, and I have to do B skips, and I have to run, and everything is like kind of a goose step where I'm very straight in one direction and my body is stiff. If you learned how to run on a treadmill, or if you learn how to run by looking at pictures of people, and you look at kinematics displays of people from the side, like you're thinking about it like a robot, it makes sense. Because if you think of the body as limbs that have leverages and they bend at fulcrums, like a very biomechanical perspective, you miss this coiling hydraulic capacity of the spine to create motion as the shoulders and hips oscillate around. Ultimately, the most important part that you need to understand is that if you want to run and be smooth and light, you have to get the shoulders and hips to oscillate. There is a smooth dance-like motion to this that starts whether you're running it slowly or you're scaling up to highest sprints. That's why so many people study the 100-meter sprint in the Olympics as a test to see how the body moves. Because if you're looking at the highest level of output, you're going to be able to see the smallest little variations exaggerated. So if you want to learn about the car driving or the output of a car, you go and you watch drag race or F1 because you can see the specifics that have been exaggerated all the way to the extremes. And when you watch these athletes run, you see them hitting the ground with tremendous force. And that force goes through the tissue of their body and shockwaves out. And if you didn't have this ability for the entire body to oscillate and to vibrate and to move with that force, it would get stuck. You would hit the ground and the force would get in the joints and have to go somewhere. Because every force has an equal and opposite reaction. It has to move. And so what you see is by hitting the ground and this rotation and coil, the force goes through the foot, into the hip, up the spine, and out through the body. You see this whip and this wave as the body moves. It's a dynamic, elastic movement that happens as the body navigates and negotiates with every single step. And every single step, you're both getting the force that's recoiling and going back into the ground to bounce off, but also the force is shooting up through the body to prepare. Because as you hit the ground on one side, you're loading and preparing to swing through on the other. And instead of thinking, I'm swinging the shoulder back in this one-dimensional plane right here, it's a down. I'm coiling, I hit the ground, and I'm rotating as I move. If you don't have access to this shoulder and hip coiling, what you end up getting is excessive extension and flexion at the shoulder and excessive extension and flexion at the hip to make up for the fact that it's rotation. If I want to think about punching, I step and I rotate and I push through. There's a rotation at the hip as I drive. Same thing with swinging a bat or a baseball club or a tennis racket. There's a rotation as I drive through, and I'm pushing off the foot. Same thing as I hit the ground, I'm striking on the outside of the foot, I'm rotating and pushing down through the foot as I pronate across the foot, into the ankle, into the knee, into the hip, and that drives through. It pushes the hips down and it pushes the shoulder up as I double down. I push through, and every single step, you're driving down, you're pushing all the way into the ground. That's the rotation in the coil that allows your body to move as a unit and rotate in this dance-like smooth method. If you stay stiff and you just stay upright and you keep your head down the center of the line, you only swing your arms around, you miss out on this elastic capacity for your body to move dynamically. And that is the difference between running as a beautiful art form that can scale up versus running as a stiff block that's just trying to maximize specific limbs swinging in a biomechanical way. I know there's a lot more you could cover with that, but it's so important, not that you understand the physics behind it, but that you understand that the body is a dynamic movement that has context. Because when you forget the context of running, that it is part of a movement capacity to hunt, to change direction, to go and to be in a dynamic setting, you end up thinking about it as, well, I just have to go from point A to point B. Running in a straight line on a paved road or a treadmill, it's fine, but it's one small context. That's like being able to say one word or one phrase. There's a whole diversity of the world that allows running to have meaning and be a beautiful thing. So if you forget that you need to be able to run to decelerate, to change direction, to jump, to spontaneously turn around and to shift, to have your head move and to have your body accelerate, and if you forget that running is one part of this dance of movement that is a negotiation with the world around you, you end up thinking about it in very plain terms, which is, how do I maximize for one specific thing? Let me reach further, land on the heel with a supermaxed cushion shoe, and roll through with a minimal amount of vertical displacement and stay horizontal. You get this very bland, saltine-like running flavor, which is this boring expression of how can I go in the same line in a straight way with the least amount of effort and force possible. But running is not like that. Running is a beautiful expression of how you can explore and explode and move and run and fly in the world. And that's what the spinal engine theory opens up for you, because you see your body as this dynamic, coiling, vibrant system that is responding to the forces and using those to propel forward. And there's no better example of that than the Ply Metrics we're going to talk about next, which is the essence of being able to hit the ground and be springy and light and bouncy and run fluidly at any pace, any distance, any terrain. That's in part 6. See you there. Now, in part 6 of the Running Fundamentals course, we're talking about Ply Metrics, and you cannot be a good runner if you are not plyometrically strong. Now, what does that mean? Well, it means you have strength relative to your body weight. Now, relative strength is different than absolute strength. Absolute strength is your absolute how much weight you can pick up, and it doesn't account for your body weight. If I'm 300 pounds, of course I can pick up something that's 300 pounds. It's my body weight. But if I'm 100 pounds, picking up something that's 300 pounds is a lot more impressive. So the ability to be relatively strong to your body weight means you can do calisthenics, you can sprint, you can jump, you can throw, pull-ups and muscle-ups. That's the strength you want when it comes to sprinting and running. One thing to remember is that sprinting and jumping is a form of strength training. One of the things the ancient Romans and the ancient tribes would do is, before they had weights and squats and deadlifts and all that stuff, they would jump and they would hold weights when they jumped, and they would sprint and they would throw things. It was a way of using their body as a form of strength training. So plyometrics are how we create that type of strength with our body by integrating fascia with our muscle, with our tendon, with our ligament, with our bone. So we're familiar with the tendons, those are what attach the muscles to bones. We're familiar with the muscles, those are what contract to pull on the bones. We're familiar with the bones, those are those long pieces of tissue that hold leverage for us. The ligaments are what hold bones together. But a lot of people aren't necessarily familiar with fascia. And now fascia is this connected tissue that wraps around your entire body. Just like you have one piece of skin that connects your body without seams, you have layers of fascia underneath. It's this webbed matrix of elastin with collagen fiber. It forms along lines of stress and creates this support structure. It creates strength for your system. If you can imagine your body without skin, it would still hold the same shape because you have this web of fascia that's surrounding everything. That fascia forms around lines of movement and it responds to stress. What type of stress? Well, specifically things that create this long stretched out motion. So if you stretch across multiple muscles and multiple joints and multiple planes of motions, that stretch you feel is a fascial stretch. And short, rhythmic, explosive plyometric that conditions your fascia. So that's where plyometrics and fascia come together. So the important part of training this fascia is A, having access to it, meaning I can roll, the foam rolling, and the massage, you get the stretching. That starts to pull and push and get the tissue to stretch. And as it stretches, it creates this self-lubricating fluid called hyaluronic acid, which you might have known, like some of the skincare stuff, keeps your collagen healthy and young and springy. That same hyaluronic acid lubricates the tissue of the fascia so that it slides and glides together. That gives you space to stretch and to move. Then a matter of how do I then go and tell my body to move. So there's people who do yoga and do all kinds of motion and foam rolling and self-myofascial release. They have great healthy fascia, but they're not strong, they're not athletic. So why is that? Because you not only have to have access to it, but you have to go and train it. And this is the explosive, bouncy stuff we do. That's Ply Metrics. If you're running, you're hitting the ground and you're doing all three phases of a Ply Metric. The eccentric stretch out phase, amortization, where you have no movement, it's a change of direction, and the concentric, the shortening of the muscle where you pop back out. You hit the ground like a trampoline, you bounce, you stretch, pop back up. That uses the bones to hold tension, the muscles to contract, to then fight. So basically the second you hit the ground, the muscles are going to try and fight and contract to create strength. And the fascia stretches the rest to kind of deform based off of what the specific stimulus is. And then that contracts, and the muscles contract, and they push off the bone and you pop back up. Every single step is bouncing one foot to the next foot, the next foot. You're absorbing force, you're compressing tissue. That's a plyometric motion. So the way you do that is you build up a foundation. So we start with things that are simple. It could be as simple as jumping rope. You're just bouncing on the front of your feet. What you'll notice is that you may not have this kind of bouncy quality that you'll see of really good athletes and animals and springy people. So you start by just thinking about, can I bounce? I stay in place, feet don't even leave the ground, but I'm creating this little bouncy stretch. And the difference is you have to be relaxed. A calf raise, for example, is a very contracted, stiff, I'm holding the tension the entire time. I have to relax and let go of that tissue and let my body bounce, bounce, bounce. That mindset of light and bouncy, that is essential. So you can start off with just, we'll call them elastic calf raises. Then you can start to leave the ground. Jump roping, for example, is an excellent opportunity to do this. And even in the studies of people who are in their 60s that are untrained, their body will have significant changes in their fascial tissue and have a remodeling to make it younger and springier and healthier. So your body will always remodel. The key is to remember that training your fascia is different than training your muscles. Training your muscles can be graded. You can do a 20% effort, a 40% effort, a 60% effort, kind of like a dimmer switch. But training your fascia is like a light switch. It means you either do enough to exceed the threshold of what you could do and you cause damage to the tissue and cause soreness, or you don't. The beauty of that is once you start to train up with little jumps, little bounds, little skips to sprints to high, big, broad jumps and high level stuff, you have a very high ceiling so that no matter what distance you run, you're always sub-threshold. And so that you can go run forever. So these guys go run marathons or longer at these fast paces and they just pop, 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 pop. They're good because they've built up a very high ceiling. Everything underneath that, that's where you start to develop, that's the strength training in a sense. That's where you're building up your capacity, your sub-threshold fascial capacity. So that's where we start off light. When you cross that threshold, you will be sore because you have made a change, a damage, a tear in the fascial tissue, which is good because that's how it heals, but that will be sore and you will feel that for days. So people that go run barefoot with me for the first time, even if I take a few weeks off and go back and run barefoot and do some sprints, whoo, you will feel that stuff. So that's what you want to keep in mind is when we're getting started, we ease into it. One thing to remember is stop while you still feel good. You don't have to overdo it. You don't have to be aggressive, but start off with 10 sets of 20 seconds. You're just bouncing off the ground. Nice and easy. Imagine you're jump roping without the jump rope. You're doing 20 seconds and you stop. And if you feel the quality drop, you stop. And you come back and do a little bit more and you build up that way. And you combine that with the running drills we'll talk about next and you start to develop a capacity. That way you prevent being overly sore. You will be sore, that's fine, it's okay, just point out weaknesses. But you are able to develop the capacity. And when you have that strong foundation, running emerges as a natural phenomenon, as opposed to having to try and make up with it with special shoes or running drills or cadence or trying to work on your form. If you have a foundation of relative strength, healthy tissue, and plyometric capacity, it just naturally emerges. And that's where we want. That's the art of running. So we'll get to that next with running drills. Part 7, we're talking about running drills. Now, there are 3 of my favorite running drills, but as I've thought about this more and coached more people, there's really only 3 running drills I would ever use. And I think that's because running should be a very simple thing that emerges. If you need a bunch of drills to teach you how to run, you're just not strong enough or you're missing some piece. This is one of the reasons I'm a big advocate for barefoot running is because I don't have to teach you how to run when it's barefoot. It's natural. Like if I put you on a harder surface and I tell you to go run down and back, you're naturally going to shift to the most effective way that's going to minimize impact. You're not going to heel strike. You're not going to land all that force into your heel and your knee and your hip and your spine. You're going to land on your forefoot. And it's going to be light and bouncy. And you're going to start to feel that over time. It may take some time to get the skin used to it, the tissue used to it, but that's all part of building a foundation. And so if there's a bunch of drills you have to work on, you're missing the point. But when you take away all the things that block your feedback, then all you have to focus on is just naturally starting to put yourself in a place where you can feel the progression. So the 3 running drills I always coach and work with, and I think everything emerges from that, is single leg bounding, backwards running, and ankling. So I'll go over each in step. With single leg bounding, I think this is both the single best litmus test for strength and an incredible way to develop tension from your foot to your hip in this one long fascial unit. So Single leg bounding also teaches you the contralateral movement. So that's swinging your opposite arm and leg together. So instead of thinking, I have to like work on this coordination piece, if I just have a movement and I have enough repetitions, I start to feel this natural opposite arm, opposite leg movement, because that's the spinal engine theory. Everything moves from the spine, the hip and shoulder girdle, that coil around the spine, that creates the oscillation, the coiling that reverberates out and is amplified by the hands and the feet. So single leg bounding does that. When I hit the ground, I tense up everything from the arch complex at the bottom of the foot to the ankle, to the lower leg, to the knee, the hip. It tenses in one unit. You hit the ground, you absorb force, you pop back up. And instead of doing a right, left cycle, it's a right, 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 right. You cut that cycle in half. So now you're working on this contralateral movement, but you're also developing strength. That's beautiful. So the single leg bounding, the way I'll set this up is I'll have people start off doing it barefoot, because that way you can feel the ground and you have no buffer between your foot and the ground, on a soft surface, of course. Try to get 50 in a row at first. If you can do 50 in a row, it could be short, it could be small little hops, it's fine. If you do 50 in a row, what you'll notice is that, okay, that's strength enough to be able to run. If you can do 100 in a row, that's generally where you're strong enough to sprint. Then you can make things harder. Can I pick the foot up higher each cycle? Can I, extend the distance? Those are things you can work on, but you'll notice that not only are you working on the contralateral coordinative running movement, but you're also getting stronger, and that's beautiful. You're hitting two birds with one stone. The next drill is backwards running. Now, backwards running is important because it trains the muscles of extension, meaning I'm actively pushing off, actively driving with each step. When we go forward, because we walk, we have heels, and our bodies are designed to be very simple, there's a lot of the cadence that happens in forward movement and forward locomotion that is kind of reactive and passive. So I can hit my heel and walk through and roll through on a walk, or a very low paced run, and with the low impact, I can roll through on the foot. A lot of the stuff happens automatically. So if I fall forward, I have a reflex that will catch me. With that said, if you only rely on those automatic passive tissues to kind of let you roll forward into things, you end up underdeveloping the muscles of extension, meaning the ankle, the foot, the ankle, the hip, the knee, the spine as I'm driving through. Those muscles that push off every step don't get developed. That's why backwards running is good. A, as long as you don't fall, you're not going to get hurt. And B, it's hard, it's effortful. You have to push off every single step. It trains every single muscle of extension, all the way from the foot, all the way through the hip. And that's perfect, because it really teaches you to drive the shoulder back, to rest, step, and reach back, and to push through your hips. So backwards running is a great strength exercise. It's going to develop the exact muscles you want to run forward, but it's not going to have the same trade-off of risk and form and all these other pieces. People feel awkward running backwards, so they have to kind of build up and develop that capacity. So as long as you have a straight line and a space, you're not going to fall or trip or get hurt. You're not going to get hurt, and that means you can actually push hard, and that's great for developing strength and intensity. Third, we have ankling. Now with ankling, you are simply training the front side mechanics. That is the front side of your body to pick up your knee. And what you're simply doing is you're stepping over every foot. All you're doing with ankling is imagine there's a line at your ankle and you're stepping over every single one. Stepping, 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 and it just trains you to pick your knee up from the hip, because a lot of times we kind of get lazy and we just reach forward with the heel as opposed to picking up from the hip and staying tall. So what you want to think about is all running is an active lift, passive fall. Actively lift up the hip and the knee from the hip flexor, from the psoas, against gravity, and let gravity drop down, and then the Ply Metric pop off the ground that we talked about in the last section, that rebounds you to the next step. It's easy, and if it's sub-threshold for your plyometric capacity, it just naturally flows. So ankling teaches you to be in this front side mechanics. Start off with ankling, which is just small little steps over every single ankle, and then you get to mid-calf level, and then you get up to knee level, and you realize that your speed and your overall cadence starts to pick up as your cycle improves. But it keeps you in this front side mechanic as opposed to overextending and reaching from behind, where you're stretching out and over leveraging your hamstring and risking injury. Those three things work to create a foundation. Then from that, I guess you could consider this a fourth drill. I think of this as the beginning of running. You have your build-up strides. The plyometric tension of the single leg bounding mixes with the strength from backwards running, mixes with the form of ankling. All of a sudden, you just start to increase your speed. And so you start off at one end of the field, you just slowly start to do an ankling drill, you pick up speed, and all of a sudden you realize, oh, I'm working at like 60%, I'm kind of cruising. And then you slow down. That's a build-up stride. You're not at 100% sprint, you're just striding. So you build up, you stride, you slow down. Build up, stride, slow down. You just start to do that. Rinse, wash, repeat, rinse, wash, repeat. That's how you start to develop the quality of your running form, and then you add quantity to that. That's how you develop into running, which we'll talk about the running form next. Those three drills will do more for you than anything else. Integrate them as part of your warm-up, and that allows you to develop capacity as you start to get better and better in terms of your feel and confidence for your running. Remember, ankling, backwards running, single leg bounding, those three will take you all the way, and it is just that simple. That's what running should be. Next, we'll talk about what it looks like. In part 8 of the Running Fundamentals course, we're talking about running form. Now, the running drills that we did in the last portion will be sufficient to teach you how to go out and feel this. So we're going to talk a little bit more about the kind of the philosophy behind why running correctly matters. Now, this gets confusing when you think about the introduction of the modern running shoe. So after 1970, you get the introduction of ethylene vinyl acetate foam, which is that kind of soft stuff underneath. It makes athletic shoes affordable and comfortable so you can go run and the people start running in mass. And there's not really much instruction on form, and people go out and they just are told to go run, and specifically to go jog, which is a form of movement done with a heel strike. They start to get injured. You see the running shoe companies making bigger shoes. You see a back and forth where injury rates increase, shoes get thicker, injury rates increase, shoes get thicker, and then now you get to 2020s and people don't know how to run and they're told to get another shoe to support their form. And it's confusing because we think, well, how am I supposed to run? How do people run before shoes? This is why we focus on the running form and the foundation first. The requisite strength to be able to run, the tissue capacity to be able to stretch, the plyometric capacity to be bouncy, those form the capacity for your body to be able to support its own weight across distance. Then the running drills, ankling, single leg bounding, backwards running, teach you the actual aspects of running. And the running emerges from that. It is an emergent art that is a part of human movement. We can, of course, add shoes. And shoes are valuable because they do buffer the impact. The problem is that shouldn't change the underlying function of the foot. If you go in heel strike, all that force goes into your bones and in passive tissue and absorbs, and that leads to injury, and that's not a healthy place to be. If you land on the forefoot, then a cue I always use is land as much surface area on the ground as possible without your heel contacting first. You then spread the force, the rate of force onset, and what tissues absorb the force, you spread that out, and you end up with effectively zero transient absorbed force in the body. Now, that only happens if you have the foundation and you can run correctly. Running is really, really simple. You just build into the drills, the ankling, backwards running, single leg bounding. Those are going to train the actual capacities you need. And you keep this mantra of light and bouncy in your mind. You stay fluid, you move from the spine, and you land on the forefoot. Now people are getting confused. Well, why do some people heel strike? Why do the top runners heel strike? Well, they can do it with shoes. I challenge anybody to go out and run go heel strike without shoes and see how it feels. If you can't do it without the technology, shouldn't that make you question some of the underlying capacity? Sure, a shoe can expand what you can do, but it shouldn't change your underlying function. And so when you go run and you focus on the art of running, which is moving well according to your body's capacity, you end up in a place where you're not going to get injured because your single focus is on how well I can go and absorb force and produce a directional output. I want to go from here to there. The reality is that running is a negotiation between you, your body, and the surface, meaning your body has to be able to deal with the constraints of how far you're going and as well as what you want to do from a goal perspective. The problem is that when we block feedback, we can go beyond what our body can actually do. If I want to go run 13 miles, but I'm only strong enough to run 10, I'm going to end up compensating for those last 3. That's where the injury happens. So you use the feedback of feeling the ground and developing a capacity for Ply Metrics and strength and using the drills to know that you have a ceiling, a threshold that you can work, and anything underneath that you're good. That's where you start to stay in injury-free running. That's where you develop the foundation. You don't have to question whether or not you have the capacity to run. And that's hugely important because if you skip that and where it lets shoes compensate for the fact that you're not strong enough, whether your feet aren't strong enough, your lower legs, your Achilles tendon, your capacity to manage your own body weight relatively isn't strong enough, you end up pushing past what you have the capacity to do. So I'm not saying running with shoes is bad. I'm just saying that's a second, it's an addition. And if you focus on building the foundation first with your strength, your tissue capacity, your plyometric ability, then you'll never get injured because you're in that sub-threshold capacity and it feels easy. And this is important because we have to focus on setting constraints for our running. For example, if you were to go and bench press and you get to the point where you fatigue and you fail and you lower the bar down, you can't get it back up, you're stuck. So you have to be mindful that I can't push past what I'm able to do. But running, there's a lot of passive built-in mechanisms that allow us to focus on just continuing to take the next step forward while scaling the distance to look for prey or for carrying things or doing other stuff, that we can kind of get stuck in this grind mode or we can push past our threshold. If we haven't built up the requisite foundation to be able to manage that, we end up grinding past what our body's able to do and we start to push into passive tissue. That's where our knees start to wear down and our body starts to feel beat up and stiff and hurt. So you have to focus on setting constraints. I'm not saying you can't run with shoes. I think they're a valuable aspect to add on to it, but it is important you start off and focus on the quality and let the feedback, get as much feedback as you can to build up the strength. And then you just focus on simple cues. Active lift from the knee, passive fall down, land on the forefoot with the heel lifted off the ground, light and easy, you're hitting the ground, you're fluid and moving, and you're moving from the spine. And the one last piece is that when you are running, you don't have to stay stuck in this one little two-dimensional plane. You can turn and shuffle, you can go backwards, you can do karaoke, you can move and change the direction. Because when we get stuck in the static position over and over and over again for miles and miles and miles on end, our body gets stiff. What I want you to think about is if you start to feel stiff, if your feet start to cramp up, if your body starts to feel like it's not at a point where it feels good to run anymore, that's when you can shake things up. You can always walk, to turn around and change the direction. You can change the elevation. You can pick your knees up. Remember that when your body feels stiff in a run, shake things up and move and reinvigorate the effort. And that will keep you fresh and focused in on what you're trying to do. So to summarize, all we're focused on in learning to run well is the art of running. The competitive aspect and the sport and the shoes and all the stuff that support you going after an ego-driven task goal, that's something else, which is important, but it can't happen healthfully if you don't build it on top of a strong foundation. And we'll talk about that in the next video where we talk about adding volume and increasing your running capacity safely. All right, in part 9, we're going to talk about increasing your volume of running and prioritizing recovery. Because if you skip the cooldown, you're going to run into issues that will crop up over time because we want to be in this for the long game. So first, we're going to talk about adding volume. We've discussed running drills, we've discussed the strength, we've discussed the running form, but how do you translate that into 5Ks, half marathons, and marathons? Well, the thing is you focus on the quality first, because you can't scale if it's not quality first. You know, you need to get the reps in, you need to get the quantity of those and practice with the running drills, the ankling, the single leg bounding, the backwards running. That way you get this feel for what it should look like, and you get into a safe rep, you can start to scale up. But the reality is that most people aren't strong enough to be able to run well for distance. And so you start off with what you can. You just shorten the distance. And so you start with 100-meter strides. And once you get to the point where you can do a 100-meter stride at 70 to 80% of your total capacity, and you can repeat that for 6, 8, 10 reps, and you feel like it's not that strenuous and your feet don't feel that sore, then you start to expand that. And then getting out on a track is an excellent place to do that because you can start with 400 meters. You run a 400 meter, you rest for an even amount of time that it took you, and you repeat that. And once you can do 400s with even recovery for 6 and 8 reps, and it's not just destroying you, then you can start to increase the volume. You do 800s, and then you do miles. And so then you start to build up this capacity to be able to manage your form. And what you want to think about is this tempo type pace. So it's a little bit faster than what you would easily have a conversation at, but a little bit slower than a fast pace. This is where you're developing your capacity for your ceiling. What starts off at first as basic running drills and strength training turns into a capacity, a single focus of running, which is I want to maintain a high quality at a decently challenging pace. That branches off into 3 different sections of running output. So we have our short, our strength or speed work. So that could be hill sprints, build-up strides, running drills, or sprints. We have our anaerobic capacity, so that's going to be interval repeats. It could be fartleks, it could be track repeats, it could be timed intervals. And then third, we have a distance and endurance focus. So this is going to be a low output, low intensity. So I think it's a conversation pace or a little bit less than that. With that, what we're focused on is developing tissue capacity, the special strength to be able to be on your feet for 10,000, 20,000, 30,000 steps, and the capillary density of your feet and your overall body, your circulation. So you notice with each of these, there's the strength, the mitochondrial density, the capillary density, changes are happening to your body, and those happen as you build up to it. But the important part is that you don't skip ahead of what you're able to do. If you focus on the distance before you can do the sprinting and hold that, you're going to run into issues where you're just butting right at your capacity. You want your capacity for what you could put out, and meaning your strength, your running form, your ability, to be high, so that everything underneath that doesn't really come close to scratching the surface. So that's going to be looking at 100-meter sprints, 400-meter sprints, and being able to do that pretty sufficiently. Then you can start to lower the intensity but increase the duration of those. You're starting to do intervals, and that's going to increase your cardiovascular capacity. Once you have the strength and cardiovascular capacity, the rest is just being able to stay in at a lower threshold and have the conversation with yourself and continue doing it. That's how you build up your capacity, but you have to think about building up from the quality first, then adding quantity to that. And the important thing is when you pair that with things that don't block feedback, so shoes that are 22 millimeter stack height or less that allow you to feel the ground, that don't compensate for weak feet, and feeling your body and paying attention to your joints, you're not going to get injured. You pair that with an effective focus on recovery. Of course, sleep and nutrition make a huge difference as well, but we'll touch on that in the competitive running aspect in part 10. But we're going to talk about recovery drills first, because the thing that people skip the most is that few minutes of recovery after they finish the run. It makes sense. You're tired, you've done the whole workout, you just want to go home and be done, you're sweaty, you don't want to sit down and take a few minutes to stretch out. It seems like a burden. But the point is to be able to have something you can do consistently and not make it complex. So I have 5 simple recovery drills that if you add them in there, they're going to make a huge difference. So the hand-foot glove, the post-tib massage, the half kneeling tib stretch, the full splay plantar stretch, and the ankle circles. So we'll go over those each, but you can do these in 2 minutes. You can either get home, you can shower, take your shoes off, and then sit on the couch and do them. But you want to make sure you prioritize getting the tissue on your foot, ankle, and lower leg healthy. You don't have to worry about your upper body as much. The hip flexors, you do want to open those up on occasion, but that's going to be lumped into your strength training more. But if you focus on getting the foot, ankle, lower leg tissue healthy after having been on it for thousands of steps, it's going to make a huge difference. So first, let's start with a hand-foot glove. All you're going to do is focus on taking your fingers through the toes and just working to mobilize this. This is really valuable because it's going to get the tissue of your toes to start to spread apart and get your feet to start to open up and move. You've been on these for a few hundred to a few thousand steps, and that's going to add up. So all this tissue tends to get beat down like your hand's making a fist. We just want to open that up. Second, we want to think about a post-tibialis massage. You're going to take the tissue behind the tibia. So this is your bone that runs from the knee to the shin. You're going to just put your thumb in and massage this piece. You can put your thumb in there and do some ankle circles and hold that and feel the tissue going. This post-tib massage is going to be very simple, accessible, easy to do. Third, we're going to do a fascial pull ankle circle. So you're going to pull up on the lower leg and do simple ankle circles moving in each direction. So you're pulling up and creating tension like you're pulling a sock up on your foot and doing simple ankle circles. Fourth, we have our tibialis half kneeling seat. So I'm sitting here, I'm leaning down and putting pressure all the way through this tissue. It's running all the way through the front and top of the foot. And I'm leaning and putting some load through there to open that up. So showing the other side, I'm simply here, sitting back, I'm leaning, I'm just opening up to the top of this foot right there. And then fourth, we have our full splay plantar stretch. So the bottom of the foot, put the toes down on the ground. You can work one leg at a time. You can drive the knee down, try and get the heel back, but open up the bottom of that foot. These are 5 simple exercises that you can work through. You don't even have to get on the ground. You can work on pieces, but if you could just start with getting the top of the foot to stretch out, the bottom of the foot to stretch out, and start to think about those 2 pieces, that's going to make a huge difference to start to get this foot healthy and functional after having been on it for thousands of steps. Most important part is that you don't skip the cool down. Take a few minutes to breathe, get your system to regulate, because that's starting the recovery for the next session. If you just go from run, heart rate's up, I'm just working and putting out effort, to just like hopping in the car, going home and just sitting down or going to the next thing, your body never gets a chance to shut off. Just taking a few minutes, even if you don't focus on those specific stretches, to open up your body, to transition out, it gets you out of this sympathetic state where I'm stressed and I'm fight flight, to the parasympathetic, I'm resting, I'm recovering, because that's going to help you get recovered for the next training session, whatever it is. But we'll focus on what it looks to be more competitive, both in mindset and your output, in part 10 to finish up the series. In part 10, we're talking about the competitive aspect of running. Now, this is going to be an additional aspect. If you don't run competitively, this is not important. But if you do run competitively, it's going to be valuable to understand this, because this is the perspective for how to think about what you're doing in the context of something that's not inherently healthy. There's the art of running, which is the expression of natural human movement. And then there's the competitive side, which is where the ego comes in and says, I want to run in this pace for this distance and this race, and I'm going to try and beat this person. Now, that's going to go beyond what you necessarily could run. Maybe you're not as strong enough, or you can't run that far, or you can't run that pace. Those are not questions you entertain because you have a specific goal. So at some point with competitive running, you're going to push your capacity up higher and higher and higher to be able to hit some goal. Now, the first thing to remember is that when people get into running, it oftentimes starts off as a pursuit of, they want to get healthy, they want to get in shape, they want to challenge themselves, they want to do something that's difficult. And so they go in the process of like, okay, maybe I can go from walking to running a mile to running a 5K to running a half marathon. And so they go through this process of more. The problem is that that becomes a trap, where there's always something more that you could do. You can always run a marathon or a double marathon or an Ironman or an ultra marathon. And so you'll see people that end up using running as a proxy for self-development, and it's like it becomes an addiction by another name. And so then they get stuck into the fact where they're beating their body up and their knees hurt, their feet are shot, their hips are broken, their spine is stiff, where they keep running and running because they don't know what else to do, because they need something to scratch the itch. So first and foremost, it's important to keep in mind that if that's your relationship with running, it's going to be short-lived, because you will injure yourself far before you ever get over this internal capacity trying to fill the hole for more. That's why I focus so much on the quality of the running first before we get into the sport of running, the commercialization, because it's easy to go and see the numbers getting faster every week, but there is a point in diminishing returns to that, because what you're trying to do isn't healthy by any means. It's good, it's a challenge, but it's a different pursuit. If you actually want the best from your body, you have to train intelligently, which means understanding what you're training for, what distance are you training for, what race you're trying to do. And then you could backtrack and say what strength you need to have, what capacity, what's my aerobic capacity, what's my anaerobic capacity, what's my overall relative strength need to be. Those are questions you can look at and break it down in the context of an intelligent training plan. And I'll say this, there are no elite athletes that do it on their own. Every single amazing athlete has a coach. And the reason for that is because a coach can see your blind spot. If you could see your own blind spot, it wouldn't be a blind spot. And your blind spot might be, you know what, you really avoid the distance running when you really should be focusing on that. Or you haven't done any strength training, or you're skipping the recovery, or you're not sleeping, or you're not eating enough. The point of competitive running is that we push ourselves to do the best we can, which means that we inevitably have to attack our weak spots. And because they're weak, because they're blind, we like to avoid them and ignore them. But that means we're not actually challenging ourselves. And the point of competing is to see how well you can perform in any one thing, which means you have to grow across the board. But before you can even ask that question, you have to have an awareness of what it is you need to train and develop. Whether it's strength, whether it's your plyometric athletic capacity, whether it's your cardiovascular capacity, whether it's recovery, those are all tools you have with a plan. But once I go into the level of I'm going to take this and turn pro at it, that means I have to work on everything. And so being able to run, express the art in the form of movement is one thing. But if you really want to take it seriously and compete and enter into a race, you have signed on for everything around that. Because if you don't, you're now taking something that is a skill set and you're going to push past what you can do, which means at some point you will reach a breaking point. You're either your body, your strength, your joints, your ability, your lungs, you'll have to push past what you can do. That means that if you're not careful, you will end up getting hurt. So when you run competitively, take it seriously. Remember, training hurt is not training smart. There is discomfort involved in training, but more is not better. Better is better. Focus on the quality first, take it seriously with everything around that, and then build up on that foundation. And the last thing to note is that when you look at nutrition, this is an individual approach. Some people love fat adapted running, which means that they're medium to high protein and medium to high fat and very low carb. Some people are carb adapted, which means that they're very low fat, medium to high protein, and medium to high carbs. It's a personal preference. Whatever you think works best for you. You play around with those things. And the running nutrition aspect is a whole different aspect. But it's important to note that you can't eat junk food and still expect to perform. Junk in, junk out. Eat real whole foods. Find the macronutrient allotment that works for you. Prioritize your sleep. Make sure your strength training and recovery is there. Focus on the quality and the plyometric capacity to run well. And then you approach the specific aspect of increasing the volume with a plan that leads up to your best performance on the race day. That's how you run competitively and not get injured. Again, you don't have to run competitively if you're a runner. I think it's a great thing to bring all these pieces together, but it is one aspect of the overall tool. I hope you've enjoyed these running fundamentals videos, a 10-part series. This covers the basics of what you need to get into it. But remember, you can't think about this stuff, you have to do it. You can't think your way into an action that you have to feel your way and learn how to do with your body. The good news is that you have the capacity to do it. You just have to get out there and feel it. You have the tools, you have the knowledge to be able to do this. Go experiment and explore and feel it for yourself. We hail from an ancestral line of people that have run for thousands of millions of years. It's very natural. You'll be able to pick it up. If you have problems, I have plenty of courses and things that you can work on to develop the strength, develop the skills, develop the technique. I'm here for you with support. Check them out in the description below. If you want any more help with this stuff, I'm here for you. Let's get to it.